Okay, so when you picture the modern Republic of Namibia, you probably immediately think of its current democratic system, right? But beneath that framework lies this incredibly deep, complex, and just vibrant history of traditional monarchies. Welcome to our explainer on the pre-colonial history of the Namibian monarchy. Today, we're going to look really closely at the historical records and some modern data to understand the roots, the structure, and the intense ongoing debate surrounding these totally fascinating institutions.
Here's a quick roadmap for our explainer today. We'll start with the roots of Namibian kingdoms, then look at matrilineal power and succession, move on to the colonial disruption, dive into the Ondonga royal rivalry, and wrap up with monarchies in modern Namibia.
All right, Section 1, Roots of Namibian Kingdoms and the 14th Century Migrations.
I was honestly blown away to learn just how wildly diverse this region's political landscape actually was. Long before European contact, Namibia wasn't some blank slate. It was this massive, intricate tapestry of traditional monarchies, kingdoms, and chiefdoms. You've got the Ovambo people, who started migrating to their current location way back around the 14th century from the Zambia region. But they're really just one piece of the puzzle. You also have the Herero, the Witbois, the Zambezi, the Kavango, and the Damara chiefs. And every single one of these groups brought their own distinct cultural, linguistic, and historical relationships to the region. It's an incredibly rich mix.
To really grasp how entrenched these institutions are, let's just trace one specific royal lineage, the Ondonga kings of the Ovambo people. I mean, just look at this timeline. We see Nembalungo Langwetha ruling as early as 1650. Then you have Shindongo Shanamutenya Gwanguti in 1690, Nangobe Yamvula in 1700, and Nembamunga Layamutundu around 1750. These were highly organized societies led by hereditary sovereign leaders, operating smoothly centuries before German or South African forces ever even set foot in the territory.
Moving on to Section 2, matrilineal power and succession, and how this traditional governance actually worked in practice.
So I want to pause here for a second and just ask you, how do you think power was inherited in pre-colonial Namibia? If you're super familiar with European history, your mind probably jumps straight to a king passing his crown directly down to his eldest son, right? Well, as we explore the historical sources for the Ovambo people, we find a completely different mechanism at play.
The Ovambo tribes actually figured their descent through a system called matrilineal kinship. Now, this is an absolutely crucial concept. It means descent is traced exclusively through the mother's line. So only those who belonged to the royal family by birth through the maternal line had any legitimate claim to the chieftainship. To put that into perspective, a hereditary chief wouldn't pass power to his own son. Instead, the next leader would arise from his sister's children or his daughter's children. It's a beautifully complex system, and it entirely changes the dynamics of royal succession.
And crucially, these weren't absolute dictatorships either. First, a king is selected from that matrilineal royal clan, but he definitely doesn't rule alone. Next, he appoints counselors, usually pulling from his own age group, and finally, ultimate authority is actually shared with a king's council, consisting of 6 senior counselors. So you can see these pre-colonial systems were highly structured, with their own built-in checks and balances, and a very clear separation of administrative powers.
Let's step into Section 3, the colonial disruption, and the rather drastic shift in traditional power.
Up until the late 19th century, these groups were pretty much untouched by European traders. But then, in 1884, Germany establishes a colony in Namibia. Initially, they kinda left the northern Ovambo groups alone and focused on the south. But, well, then World War I happens, and by 1915, South African forces take over the administration. From there, we see colonial authorities actively and aggressively dismantling local governance. A prime example is in 1924, when South Africa legally stripped all powers from the Rehoboth Baster captain, transferring them over to a South African-controlled magistrate.
And listen, this wasn't just some political change on paper. It was a fundamental manipulation of tradition itself. To serve their own needs, colonial authorities sometimes completely manufactured hereditary power where it hadn't even existed before. They propped up these colonial-aligned chiefs whose primary job essentially became enforcing colonial labor and taxation, instead of actually protecting their community's interests. The organic connection between the leadership and the people was just severely manipulated.
All right, Section 4, the Ondonga royal rivalry. Let's look at a fascinating case study in resistance and collaboration.
We can see all this tension playing out perfectly in the contrasting strategies of 2 brothers from the Ondonga royal family back in 1884. On one side, we have King Kambonde Kampingana, who was enthroned as the legitimate king. He ruled Western Ondonga, and historical records describe him as being, well, quite friendly to the missionaries and European settlers. On the flip side, we have his brother, Nahale Yampingana. Nahale flat out refused to recognize Kambonde's rule. He broke away, established his own separate kingdom in eastern Ondonga, and, in stark contrast to his brother, he fiercely resisted the alien settlers.
Now this brings us to a super compelling historical debate. The sources tell us that in 1904, Nahale famously and relentlessly attacked the German Namutoni fort. Because of this really fierce anti-colonial resistance, he's revered by many today as a hero, and people often refer to him as a king. But traditional historians are quick to point out that according to strict Ondonga customs, which absolutely require a specific coronation process and royal burial rites, Nahale was actually never officially crowned a king. It's just a fascinating example of how modern historical memory and traditional cultural law can sometimes look at the exact same figure completely differently.
And finally, Section 5, Monarchies in Modern Namibia. Let's unpack the post-colonial debate.
51. That is a massive number. Despite being a modern democratic republic, the Namibian government today officially recognizes 51 different traditional authorities operating actively across the country. Oh, and they have another 40 applications currently pending.
So what do they actually do? Well, these monarchies are absolutely not just symbolic relics of the past. They hold tangible, significant power. They control and distribute communal land. They formulate and enforce customary law. They step in to handle minor local judicial disputes. And on top of the whole shebang, they receive direct support from the state. We're talking administrative allowances and even official vehicles. They are highly active, on-the-ground political actors in contemporary Namibia.
And because of this active political power, there is a pretty intense, ongoing debate in the country right now. As one of our sources critically puts it, and I quote, "In the final analysis, monarchy is feudalism surviving inside contemporary society. Monarchy is incompatible with decolonization." Some critics argue that these traditional systems can stabilize the ruling class, suppress grassroots dissent, and inherently contradict the egalitarian goals of a modern democracy.
So it really comes down to this incredibly complex balancing act. On one hand, you have a very real desire to preserve deep-rooted indigenous African traditional leadership, institutions that miraculously survive the brutal, targeted disruptions of colonialism. But on the other hand, you have critics arguing that true decolonization requires dismantling all inherited hierarchies. They advocate for entirely democratic, egalitarian structures where citizens simply don't act as symbolic subjects to a royal family.
So, I want to leave you with this thought. How does a modern republic reconcile its democratic ideals with the incredibly deep roots of its traditional monarchies? It is for sure a question without a simple answer. But understanding this rich history, from the 14th century migrations and matrilineal succession all the way through the colonial disruptions, is really the only way to truly grasp the debate today. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep exploring, and as always, keep questioning.